Hey brother, welcome back to the Making of a Nice Guy series. In this video, I want to talk to you about how we can feel powerless, how we can feel trapped, how we can feel dependent, and how we can feel victimized in our life, especially in the formative years of our childhood. How those moments can actually contribute to us creating rules for ourselves, operating instructions about what we need to do and who we need to be in order to be safe and secure and get our needs met and please other people so that we'll be okay, so that we'll be happy. I want to talk to you about that, and I want to tell you a story, my own personal story, and I want to hear your story. So when I was a child, my mother and stepfather, their primary form of entertainment, and I chuckle a little bit at that idea, is that they like to go to the bar, they like to drink, they like to spend their time numbing out, as we do a lot these days with television and food and weed and alcohol and whatever else it is that we distract ourselves with so that we don't have to face what's really going on with us. And so they would go to the bar and they would drag me with them. I wasn't at an age, I was about 11 years old or so, and they wouldn't let me just stay home by myself. They would drag me to the bar, and so that meant that I didn't have any real options. I had to do what they said, and it wasn't a whole lot of fun. There was only so many things that you could do, and you could sit there, and it just wasn't a good time. And they would always argue and fight and get into a conflict, and there would be some sort of fallout that would ensue. And so it was just never a good time to go to the bar and hang out. Well, eventually I became 12, and they decided that that was old enough for me to not go, and I had put up enough of a resistance, enough of a fuss without angering them, that they decided that they would leave me home. And so every weekend, or sometimes during the weekdays, they would go out to the bar and they would drink and party and have a good time, until they didn't have a good time, because there would always be a fight. There would always be something that she did or something that he said, and that would set one of them off, and then the next thing you know, they would be into a real fight, a screaming match, a slamming of doors, a fight. And so that would happen over and over and over again. I would start the night out waving them goodbye, saying, have a good time, have fun, really pleading with them to enjoy themselves. And then they would go away, and there would be some peace and quiet. There'd be some time to myself. I would wash dishes and watch TV and just be okay by myself. But then eventually what happens is that it happened enough that they came home angry and violent and fighting and screaming and throwing things and slamming things, that eventually what happened is I became almost like PTSD. I became traumatized. I became very sensitive to car doors. We lived in a trailer park. When other people would shut their car doors, I would hear slamming of doors, and I'd be like, oh, they're home. And I would pull the curtain back and look, and nope, they're not home yet. It's too early. And then eventually, though, it would be them, and there would be a slamming of doors, and there would be a screaming that you could hear outside of the trailer. And then the door would jerk open, and then they would bring all of that drama into the house and scream and yell at each other and fight. And I was just there. You know, it was punctuation to my peaceful evening. And it was something that eventually I just became so incredibly fearful of, that I knew it was going to happen over and over and over again. And each time I prayed and I begged and I pleaded in my heart for them to have a good time and to not fight and let this night be different. But it just was the same night over and over and over again. It was the Groundhog Day of childhood, of going to the bar. And that was something that drove deep into me a fear, an unsettledness, an unsure, a lack of safety, that I wasn't okay, that even in those moments of peacefulness, when I was by myself, it was like being in the eye of the storm. The storm had passed over and everything was quiet and the wind had settled down and you could kind of catch your breath, but we also knew that the storm was continuing to move, and that when you moved out of the eye of the storm, you were going to be back in the rain and the winds and the danger. And so that was something that I experienced, and it was something that affected me deeply as a child, and something that I carried into my adult life, that the shoe was going to drop, that something bad was going to happen, that things were going to come out of the shadows, and that if I could have just gotten them to enjoy themselves, if I could have just pleaded with them harder, or somehow convinced them to have a good time, that I would have been okay, that things would have been different. But that's not true. That's not how that worked. In fact, they were having their own human experience. They were having their own fight, their own conflict with themselves, their own fight and conflict with each other. And I just happened to be part of that story, unwillingly, undesiringly, but it was part of the story. And that also taught me that there were things outside of my control that I couldn't prevent. And that made me feel victimized. It made me feel dependent. It made me feel like I needed them to be different for me to be okay. And if you haven't read the book, No More Mr. Nice Guy, I highly recommend you read that book, because he talks about this exact thing, that we think that if we can get people to do and behave the way that we need them to, the way that we want them to, then that we'll be okay. If we can just manage other people's emotions, if we can manage other people's behavior, then we'll be okay. And so that's the rule that I created for myself, and that's the rule that I tried to live by. And it caused lots of conflict, lots of troubles in my relationship, and lots of turmoil within myself, a lot of confusion, frustration, resentment. And I lived in fear that something was going to eat me, fear that something was going to come out of the shadows and get me, that the shoe was going to drop. So if you experience something like that in your own life, and you came up with rules for yourself, you came up for a set of operating instructions, and you felt dependent on somebody else's behavior for your safety and security, then I want to talk with you about that. I want to hear your story. I want to be able to ask you clarification questions, questions where you can actually challenge your beliefs and ask yourself, is that true? And is that serving me? And do I want to live that way? I want to share my own insights and perspectives with you, insights from men that I've coached and worked with. And I want to be able to point to resources. And I also want to be able to work with you to come up with a game plan so that you can move forward and experience something different in your life. Because I can guarantee you, brother, you don't have to live here anymore. You don't have to stand around that campfire. That little boy doesn't have to wait for the car doors to slam and the drama to come into the house anymore. You can be free of that. I know, because I'm free of that. So that's the conversation I want to invite you in. So there's a link in the description. Pick a day and time that works for you, that we can talk. We'll talk by phone, and we'll work through this together. Until then, brother, be kind to yourself, and I'll talk to you soon.